Hi everyone. In this particular video, I wanted to offer a counter argument to my last video, the video that I did yesterday, suggesting that David was not responsible for the creation of the xenomorph as we know it in the Alien franchise. But what if David is? What if he is responsible for the creation of the xenomorph as we know it? But rather, the xenomorph as we know it isn't what we think it is. It isn't a species. It isn't a weapon, a bioweapon, or rather, what David has created is merely a piece of art, so to speak. In that, the xenomorph that we see in Ridley Scott's Alien in 1979 is this type of creation. So, what he has presented us with in Alien Covenant, the bombs that the space gardeners use to wipe out all life on a planet before they begin seeding it with their own, those are the space bombers, the gardeners of space. And what David has created is an artistic creation that doesn't really serve any type of purpose other than to make an artistic statement. As the Joker in The Dark Knight said, it's about sending a message. And this is the message that David, as a similar agent of chaos, is sending to the engineers. David is effectively Satan from Paradise Lost through Ridley Scott's reinterpretation of that play via a cinematic approach. David is Satan in such a way that he is corrupting the engineer's perfect garden via his corruptions, his artistic statement that he is making through the creation of the xenomorph, which is again essentially a perversion of engineer technology or a corruption of the engineer's godlike plan. And I'll talk more about this halfway through the video. But for now, I also want to talk about the xenomorph purely as David's creation and the nature of the engineer species in regards to their culture and why they may be devoid of artistic creation, the kind of which David represents through his own villainous actions. As on display in Ridley Scott's film Alien, made in 1979, where Ash describes it as the perfect organism. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility. And it doesn't really seem to serve any purpose in that film other than to be incredibly violent. And it's not even the most efficient killing machine as in Alien Covenant. If you see the bioweapon on display as utilized by David, who stole this technology from the engineers and then turned it against the engineers' own creations, the inhabitants of this colony or planet, we see that that weapon is actually much more effective than the xenomorph in Alien or the protomorph in Alien Covenant. So you have to ask yourself, what is David up to in this particular situation? Where he's essentially experimenting artistically, or he's painting in blood, or painting in stolen alien technology, painting in the fire of the gods. He's essentially playing with fire artistically and creating something that he thinks is beautiful. This creation is very perverse as an art form. It's equivalent to, say, using dead bodies as art. Say the wax figurines in the Duchess of Malfi, utilized by Ferdinand to convince his sister, the Duchess, that her entire family has been murdered, when they in fact have not. They are wax sculptures in that play, at least initially, and he is using this to sort of torment the Duchess by presenting her with these dead bodies in a dark room where she can't really tell the difference. And that's kind of what David's doing. He's creating this perverse artwork purely for the sake of it. It doesn't really serve a purpose as a weapon in the sense that it has a military application the way the engineer's technology ostensibly does, or even a scientific application, the erasing or eradication of all fauna on a planet so that only flora remains, and thus granting the engineers the ability to seed planets with life as they see fit. There are certain applications where in David's case, in the words of Oscar Wilde, all art is useless, or all art is a telling of beautiful lies. It doesn't have a practical sort of purpose. It simply exists for its own sake. And with David, this creature, this xenomorph, doesn't exist for any scientific purpose. It doesn't exist necessarily for a military application. So it seems almost out of place if one were to say consider it through the applications that the engineers often partake, the military application and the scientific application. It seems to exist sort of outside of what they use the technology for. So David's artistic sort of slants on this stolen alien technology is his injecting a bit of morbid art into what is otherwise a purely scientific or military culture. And I think that's certainly very interesting, and also it suggests something else about the engineers that may or may not be true. This isn't something that we'll know either way about them until we see a sequel to Alien Covenant, if we see a sequel, in regards to how they function as a society. And we haven't really seen very much about them to really suggest that they are this or that, beyond perhaps the most damning or telling quality being that the last engineer, being that their facility on the planet or moon in Prometheus was overrun. But perhaps this was an isolated incident. Perhaps the massacre at this station is again equivalent to the pilot Yannick's anecdote that he delivers to Vickers after she kills Charlie in Prometheus. He says he saw these scientists go into this box where they were working on something and it got out, and he had to push a button and blow up this science facility effectively. And he said, in regards to Vickers, it was her time to push the button effectively, and perhaps something similar happened with the engineers. They made something, it got out, the end. That was his sort of analogy of what happened. And perhaps, again, it doesn't really say anything more about their culture except that they made some type of Promethean mistake, playing with the fire of the gods, that forbidden knowledge through forbidden science, that kind of thing. It merely illustrates that they are not a perfect culture, despite the fact that they may or may not be a purely militaristic or scientific culture. It doesn't really say much about them as how they operate, apart from the fact that they have apparently a complete lack of scruples in regards to seeding planets. You know, that they are effectively playing God in this situation, but we don't really know much about them in regards to them as artists. So when we have David effectively operating not as a scientist or military man, but as he describes himself to be an amateur zoologist in Alien Covenant, or an artist, someone who again is effectively, instead of utilizing the fire of the gods for purely military or scientific purposes, as the engineers ostensibly do in the prequels, David is utilizing it for artistic expression. And it also suggests that he's injecting something into the engineer's ethos, if you will. The injecting of evil or something akin that is lacking. He's injecting something that is lacking in the engineer culture, potentially. There's no way to really know this. Because again, in regards to their art, you could say that the mural on the moon facility in the film Prometheus could have been artistic, but then again, perhaps not. Perhaps like the hieroglyphs on the walls of the pyramids of Gaza and Egypt, we don't really know its purpose. It could be artistic purely for the sake of it, but it could also serve some other societal function or a military function or the storage of data or an illustration for something other than just painting for the sake of it. So we can't really say what kind of culture we're dealing with here, and if it is a purely sort of non-artistic culture or a non-creative culture in the sense that they are just artists for the sake of it, then David is sort of bringing that or injecting that into the engineer's technology, which he stole from them. It kind of reminds me of Satan in Paradise Lost, where he's going into this garden where there doesn't exist good or evil, essentially, and he's this corrupting agent, and he is effectively corrupting God's perfect garden, God's Eden. And it's interesting, you know, he is the satanic character of this particular series, or this particular facet of the franchise. He is Satan to Paradise Lost. He is the satanic character who essentially obfuscates or deconstructs or undermines God's order. And who is the God in this instance? The engineers. And how does David undermine their order, their way of controlling the universe through seeding planets? He goes about artistically creating something that serves no purpose. So when you have the technology of the engineers, it can be said that they are using it purely for military purposes, or purely for scientific purposes, or purely for some type of purpose, some God-ordained mandate where they are utilizing it to sort of extend their presence in the universe through the seeding of planets, creating their own garden, if you will. Again, Ridley calls the engineers the gardeners of space, and God was essentially the gardener with a capital G. You know, he was the head gardener. He created the Garden of Eden, and he populated it with men and women. You know, it's a very biblical sort of concept that Ridley Scott has created with these sort of space deities, these space jockeys and these engineers. And David essentially represents the antithesis to that with his artistic creation, which serves no purpose other than to be a mockery of what the engineers are doing. The engineers use this technology to sort of cement their footprint on the universe, to create this super garden of seeded planets and genetically manufactured races. And then you have David, who takes the same technology that the engineers would use for this purpose, and he creates something perverse, something that sort of personifies or represents his artistic vision of what is perfect. And what is perfect in his mind is chaos, is something that sort of represents being outside of this godlike order, this structure. That is what David sees as perfect. Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility. It's unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality, but also God's law. It's a godless creature. It's a creature that exists outside the mandates passed down by these engineers, while at the same time utilizing the technology that they themselves would use to reinforce their own mandates. It's David essentially being ironic, or committing a double offense, trespassing against them using their own technology. It'd be like stealing someone's lamp from their house and then braining them with it. And I like that about David. So this suggests that David's intent isn't to invent, but rather to subvert those that he believes to think that they are superior to him and everything else in the universe by essentially playing God. And he is out there to illustrate that they are not gods, they're not infallible, that the things that they create can be destroyed just like he can be destroyed. He's essentially illustrating their imperfection. They are not these unstoppable deities, or at the very least, the sandcastles that they make, he can walk up to and kick. And that is kind of the point of David as a character, in the same sense that Satan in Paradise Lost was sort of pointing out the flaws of God's plan, or lack thereof, by essentially defacing the garden, by tempting Adam and Eve with fruit from the tree of knowledge. So from that point of view, I think David isn't an inventor. He's not supposed to be an inventor. And he's not actually trying to create a weapon, or rather not a weapon in the sense that you might think, not the way that the engineers would create a weapon. When the engineers create a weapon, they create a weapon to erase all life on a planet so that they can seed it with their own. Whereas David, his weapon is an attack of a different sort. Rather than attacking the engineers directly by, say, bombing them, he can also attack them ideologically. by creating something that goes against everything that they stand for, order, this universal sort of creation where they're at the top, he's essentially creating a mockery of that, a false idol, something that he can worship as opposed to whatever they think is the end-all be-all. And yet at the same time, I do think it's curious that they have their own sort of temple where the xenomorph is present in some shape or form, but perhaps this could be equivalent to, say, having Satan on a stained glass window in a church. You know, he is illustrated in such a way to warn the inhabitants of the church of his existence, not to worship him, but rather to point out that this could happen and it should be avoided, or you should not listen. This makes me wonder if that's the reason that the engineers have this mural on this temple on the moon in the film Prometheus. Perhaps there are other rebellious factors besides David. You know, there are those who have preceded David, come before David, who had similarly religious attitudes. So in this sense, perhaps David isn't the first mover in being a rebel, in being someone who sort of rebels against his maker. Doesn't everyone want their parents dead? Well, if there were parents before David's parents who had children, perhaps those children also rebelled against those parents the way that David rebelled against Wayland and against God. So it's fun to think about. I really think this is what Scott is getting at here when he's addressing some of these religious ideas, or he's taking this type of allegory with Paradise Lost, where he has David and he has the engineers, and they all play a respective role in Milton's epic poem. And I like that. You know, it's a little bit obscure. Many people nowadays, of course, don't read Milton. They don't read Paradise Lost, but it was a very influential play all the same. And the way that people interpret Christianity and religion nowadays, a lot of it has to do with Milton's poem. The word Lucifer, for instance, comes from Paradise Lost. Apart from that play, it didn't really have any sort of use in the Bible except for one obscure passage. So when people say Lucifer fell from heaven, he's the bringer of light, all of this actually comes from Paradise Lost. But this is how people interpret Christianity, through this obscure poem that nobody reads anymore. It just goes to show that something can be canonical even if it isn't a movie made by 20th Century Fox. And this is the type of thing that Ridley Scott is exploring as an intellectual, as someone who is interested in exploring literature and not just stuff in movies, okay? He's not James Cameron, who's making a sequel to a movie and then kind of expanding on that mythology. His mythology that he is exploring is outside of cinema, but he's putting it into cinema and sort of talking about it the way a director who makes a film would. And I can respect that as someone who likes movies, as someone who likes mythology or literature. I can appreciate if you combine the two, but I can understand why certain people would be confused by this when they don't necessarily read classical literature. They don't read Milton.
Paradise Lost. Well, it's a very long poem, written a long time ago, and I'm sure a lot of you have difficulty understanding exactly what Milton was trying to say. Certainly we know that he was trying to describe the struggle between good and evil, right? Okay. The most intriguing character, as we all know from our reading, was Satan. Now, was Milton trying to tell us that being bad was more fun than being good? Okay. Don't write this down, but I find Milton probably as boring as you find Milton. Mrs. Milton found him boring too. He's a little bit long-winded. He doesn't translate very well into our generation, and his jokes are terrible.
And there isn't really much to take away from his lecture in that film, except that being bad is more fun than being good, a fact that I think David illustrates quite aptly in Alien Covenant or Prometheus. He's the most entertaining character. He's the vice character, just like the vice characters in Shakespeare's plays are the most fun. Or Ferdinand in The Duchess of Malfi is perhaps more entertaining in certain aspects because he's shit nuts, and you just can't wait to see what he does next. And at the end of the play, essentially turns into a werewolf and goes mad, and then finally, I believe, either succumbs to his illness or commits suicide or is murdered. One of those three. But it's entertaining stuff. It's the stuff of good plays, I think. And that's something that Ridley Scott also understands, which is why in Alien Covenant he not only had Michael Fassbender play David, but he also had him play Walter. And you had this really interesting sort of relationship between essentially what were polar opposite characters forced to sort of communicate, at times in a very violent fashion. So I just wanted to make this video really quick and address that counter argument, the idea that David isn't an inventor and he isn't really supposedly improving on this engineered technology, because that isn't the point. Rather, he is artistically creating a parody of what the engineers hold sacred as gods of the universe, as masters of the universe. He is essentially creating something that goes against everything that they stand for, and that is the point. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Till then, take care, guys, and watch the skies.